Assalamu alaikum, namaste, sat sri akal and good day. You are listening to Awaz Community Radio. Your host for today is Saira, and we have a guest in the studio, Tahra. We'll be talking about what's on the news at the moment. So if you would like to get in touch with us, our number is 0161 839 7857. You can email us awazradio@hotmail.com or log on to our website www.awazcommunityradio.com. Perhaps you want to contact us on the social media. We're on Facebook, Awaz Community Radio, or you can tweet us, Awaz Radio 122. Thank you for listening to Awaz Community Radio with your host Saira. So I would like to extend a special thank you to Tahra for coming in.
Thank you, Saira. Pleasure as always to come in.
And today we'll be talking about what's on the news. So Tahra, what have you seen that's on the news and it's kind of interesting you or troubling you?
Well, I suppose as a teacher or an ex-teacher now, one of the topics that sort of jumped out at me today was one of the behavior management in schools, and one of the suggestions was that we should get children to do litter picking, which was rather disturbing, I think, from my perspective. I'm thinking if life was that easy and it was a simple case of sending children out to pick litter up, perhaps we should start the day by picking litter and we won't have problems for the rest of the day.
So litter picking or community service is being proposed as a way of punishment in schools, as well as writing lines. So your stance is clearly anti.
It is anti. I have certainly seen places and teachers who have actually actively gone out in the afternoon during detention time and taken children out to sort of do litter picking, that sort of thing. However, I think the whole message and the message you'd leave children with is completely wrong. While you have the positive aspect of litter picking, yes, you have a tidier, cleaner playground. However, the playground or the classroom, wherever the litter picking is being done, should be tidy and should be the responsibility, should be something that children take pride in. Not a punishment. It should not be a punishment. If I ask my child to tidy up his bedroom or her bedroom, it's not a punishment. I want them to live in a clean, healthy environment, and they should be taking pride in it. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yes, I definitely see where you're coming from. That it's you want, because the activity itself then becomes seen as a bad activity. It's a punishment. The activity itself is wrong.
Absolutely.
Bad, as if looking after your environment is wrong.
Absolutely. I mean, how can keeping a school tidy or your classroom tidy, how can that actually be a punishment? When has that become a punishment? Are we then saying a cleaner who comes in at the end of day is being punished for cleaning that room?
That's a really good point to make.
You know, I mean, what are we saying in society when we talk about punishing people by asking them to clear up the litter? I have certainly been with people who have wound down a window and chucked a piece of paper out, and my heart just stops, and I want to stop the car and go back and retrieve that piece of paper. And it annoys me. It absolutely annoys me that we sort of have that sort of weird attitude that this is my space, your job, my job. And cleaning and tidying seems to have become a negative thing. And actually, litter picking is advocated as behavior management and actually punishment, which has simply got to be wrong.
So what do you think would make a good punishment? I mean, what do you think is an effective punishment? Because I think with your background as a teacher, you perhaps have a different perspective to myself, who is a parent and not a teacher.
We probably have very similar approach. I think, yes, there are certain issues to do with managing 30 children plus sometimes in a classroom, which bring in their own issues and behavior management strategies that you put into place. However, I think there are some things that we just know instinctively, things that we do in terms of behavior management. Behavior management in schools is a whole school issue, and it is one that takes place at many levels, including sort of at classroom levels when you sort of shut the door behind you. it's become a tricky subject, and certainly in my experience over the last few years, it has very definitely, in my opinion, deteriorated. Schools have become harder places in terms of managing behaviour.
See, some people would equate the loss of, well, teachers not being able to use corporal punishment, for example. Some people would equate that with the kind of fall, as you say, the deterioration in behaviour. What do you think are the reasons for the kind of loss of control in some cases?
Corporal punishment in itself is a form of losing control. If you come away from the classroom and think as a parent, if you were to actually physically hit your child because they've done something, that is often when you have lost control, not the child. The child may have done something that is inappropriate or whatever, or damaging in some sense. But when you raise your hand to that child, slap them across the legs or whatever, it is you who have actually lost control at that point. So in terms of sort of losing corporal punishment, it's not a major to-do. Corporal punishment was probably much more prevalent in private schools, and probably less so in state schools anyway. And yet you will find that since corporal punishment has gone, state schools have not seen the same deterioration in behaviour as state schools have.
So, for example, because this is what's being proposed by the government at the moment, giving children lines or making them pick up the litter, what would you suggest as appropriate punishment, effective punishment?
I think we move from the point of saying why the children are misbehaving in the first place and actually tackle the causes. We might actually get to the punishment side later. I think punishment has become a very difficult sort of strategy in terms of management in schools, because if a child chooses to misbehave in your classroom, there is very little you can actually actively do. I mean, what would a parent suggest? Beat the child? Throw them out? What would you actually want to do with that person? And if that's happening day in, day out, even with 5-year-olds in a primary school, where does one go with that? So in terms of behavior management, there are lots of strategies. For example, in a classroom, you would never say, can somebody open a window if that's what you wanted to do. You would actually say, John, would you get up and open that window, please? That way you're actually directing instructions and directing behaviour in a very meaningful way. And lots of little strategies like that to actually keep children occupied and actually focused in what they're actually doing. I certainly, as a primary classroom teacher, I used to have a whole set of strategies that were up on the wall, and actually children took responsibility in terms of what they actually did and how they managed that work. And of course it was monitored by me very carefully that they were actually doing it, but the responsibility was one of theirs. And I think that is something that's actually missing now. We're moving into an arena where children are very aware of their rights, but very few are aware of their responsibility. Back to the litter picking. Litter picking is not a punishment. Litter picking is what you do to make your immediate environment tidy.
It's a responsibility as a citizen, isn't it?
Absolutely. And therein lies a problem. If we are now seeing responsibility as punishment, then we've moved away from what should be normal behaviour, absolutely acceptable behaviour, into one of I will and I won't do. And I think that is becoming quite an issue with a lot of parents. And unfortunately, sometimes parents themselves are to blame. I have certainly been in situations where parents have come in screaming, kicking and screaming because their child's been punished in some way or the other. And I feel there isn't a cohesion in terms of community involvement in terms of managing our children's behaviours. Because I suspect these behaviours are becoming a problem at home as much as they are in schools.
So with the behaviour management and effective punishments for school children, do you think there's a difference with boys and girls as to what is effective? What is effective for boys is different for girls?
Probably, most probably, because I think that there is a whole gender issue, and I think how we bring up children makes a huge difference. The expectations we have of our children and where we expect them to see them going. I mean, there is an expectation, particularly I find in some Asian communities where girls are to be seen and not to be heard. And therefore how we relate to children is different. How we then manage poor behaviour is again very different, and what we expect to do with that.
That still exists, doesn't it? I mean, even though it's the 21st century, we still have within Asian communities, and perhaps sort of in Western society as well, where the difference between boys and girls is great in the way we bring them up.
Hugely, and I think it starts even pre-birth, because if you remember, I mean, I certainly remember time back when I had my children, and the gender of your child was not known, or certainly not talked about in a big way. Now, within weeks of being pregnant, you actually know the gender of your child, and what I've actually seen happen sort of quite radically is that everything has become pink and blue. So from the very onset, your children's room is either going to be pink or blue, and that carries on into toys, into the way we talk to them, into what we buy them, into the clothes we wear, and certainly things like children's beauty parlors that have kind of springing up. Recently, a friend of mine took her child to a pamper party, and she's only 9. And you sort of think, well, if girls are going to pamper parties at age 9, what are we saying to them? What are we saying about values in society?
We're really pushing the whole point about that looks are important, a lot more important than we want them to feel, really. I think even parents who believe that it's what's on the inside that matters most, I don't think a lot of parents realise what can happen from this. I think when I've brought up the topic of pamper parties or the way certain ideas and images are being pushed on young girls, I've got the response from a lot of parents, lighten up, it's one party, or it's just one thing. But I feel like, and I think as you do, it all contributes, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And if we're saying, a little bit of nail varnish on a 7-year-old, 10-year-old is not a big to do, well, we're not doing that to boys. We're not sort of constantly focusing on what they look like. I mean, I've certainly been in an environment. My mum passed away recently, for example, and a lot of people came visiting. And one example was where a relatively young mum and dad came in with their 2 children. A young girl who probably was in her early teens, and their little boy who was 6. He walked in as confident as they come, marched in, shook hands with everybody, asked how everybody was, and generally totally confident in entering an environment where he was meeting complete strangers. The girl, on the other hand, sat down absolutely, completely, totally meekly, did not utter a word throughout the time she was sat there, and left not having conversed or met eyes with anybody in that room. So in that sense, what are we saying? Even as young parents who clearly, possibly themselves have been born in this country, how are they genderizing their children? What are they saying to their children in terms of their responsibilities and their role in society?
That's a really good point to make. I think that boys, when they speak up, it's seen as a sign of confidence, and I'm constantly seeing in articles I read or the films that I watch, where if a woman has a voice, she's given certain labels like feisty or aggressive, or she's compared to a man for being outspoken the same way a man would be. But with a man, perhaps we expect it. But like you say, it's done from birth, pre-birth. We're all expected to conform to certain ideas we have about men, the role that men play, or the characters that they have, and the same with women.
Absolutely, and successful men have certainly aggressive attitudes, and women who exhibit the same strategies and same tone or same language will be sort of vilified for that. Absolutely. And so there is a lot to be said in terms of genderizing in workplaces too, and the expectations we have.
And successful women in place of work, they're seen as selfish if they focus on their career, because biologically speaking, we're the only ones that can have the children. But no one questions if a man is in his late 30s and has no children and he's focusing on his career. But it seems to be a concern for society when women do that. So we're not treating boys and girls the same, no matter what age it is. Even when they're adults, when they are old enough to be parents themselves, we are putting them in boxes and expecting certain things.
Workplaces are quite sort of hard places for women, aren't there? I mean, you fall into this. If you continue with your career, you, as you say, fall foul of society in terms of what you're actually doing and whether you're actually a good woman. Being a good woman and being a career feisty woman in career terms is almost seen as incompatible. And somewhere along the line, your career has to take a back burner, and you have to sort of give up and yes, perhaps you might have a break in terms of for maternity and what have you, but nevertheless there is still an attitude in terms of certain behavior patterns are expected and not expected in work from women.
I think with the example of, I think, is it Marissa Mayer, the very well-known CEO, I think, is it of Yahoo? She went back to work after, I think, was within a few days of giving birth. But this is a woman who is a millionaire, who's an extremely powerful and a well-paid job, therefore has not got the obstacles that a lot of other women have, such as the fact that they're dealing with low pay or the lack of childcare or certain other barriers, learning disabilities, perhaps the cultural kind of issues affecting them. So whilst I think having women in such high important jobs and making them having them talked about is a good thing, it worries me when she's put up as an example. Well, she went back to work after a few days. Why can't other women do the same? Because she's not the typical woman.
She's not a typical woman, but are we then saying it's acceptable and okay for a newborn child to be left in the care of another human being and the mother to go back to work? Why is that okay? Why is somebody, either parent, mother or the father, not looking after this child or not being given an opportunity to do so? Why are we expecting strangers to look after our children?
I feel that women are, in generally, in my experience, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't.
Absolutely.
You go back to work within a few days to try and keep up with your male colleagues, then you're a bad mother, for example.
Yeah.
You don't go back to work and you stay at home on maternity leave, and you're seen as sponging off because you've stayed at home to look after your baby.
Okay, so no-win situation.
Yeah.
And certainly the messages we give to the male colleagues in those positions too. My son works in an environment where long hours are an absolutely compulsion. They all work seriously long hours. And he's recently got married and said, and it was an interesting conversation. You could see his sort of face changing as we went through the conversation. But he started off by saying, "Oh, so-and-so's just had a baby in my workplace and she was back at work in 10 weeks. 10 days. And I was absolutely mortified. I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Oh, there's a nursery she takes the little one to, and the mother doesn't go home till about 10 at least most nights." And my face just fell, we had a long discussion about the appropriateness of such sort of expectations in society.
Do you think that was her personal choice, or do you think that is something that she feels that she has to do?
Oh, I think she would have to do it. I think if she didn't do it, she'd be out of that job before you know it. It's that sort of cutthroat environment they work in. I think it's a case of you take a break, you may as well kiss your career goodbye. It was one of those scenarios. And I think it's very sad that we have that kind of sort of career path at the top ranks, where there isn't room for families, there isn't room for looking after one's loved ones in the same way. And this woman, I'm certain, would have been out of a job if she hadn't sort of gone back to work when she did. But that then leaves the message to young men that that's an okay thing to do. That is an expectation. Women have to have children. Women have to run a home. Women will also have a high-powered career.
And it's not that women don't want it all. A lot of women do want it all, but it's not that you can always manage to have it all. And I think, that kind of I've heard that so many times about women being under pressure to go back to work as quickly as possible. So what's happening to the children who are then, and I'm not putting down the nursery or the childcare she's organised, but if mothers aren't around for their children during their formative years, what effect is that having on the future generations? With not having their parents around, the parents are too busy working to pay for the bills and pay for the money for them to be looked after.
Absolutely. Whose responsibility is it to bring our children up? Are we then back to this business of picking litter up as a punishment and not as a community role that we actually play as a sort of whole? Where is the community? Where is the whole business of actually being part of a wider set of people where we look after each other? If we actually see children as being farmed up to be looked after by somebody else, who is going to be there, as you said, in the formative years to actually shape their attitudes and behaviours? Who is going to be there to actually sort of look at their behaviour? Who is going to give them the cuddle and the kiss and the love? After all, we also sort of work in an environment where to touch a child is now such a big no-no in the workplace. and I don't mean just physical punishment, I mean in a loving sense too. You'd be just seen as a paedophile or seen as inappropriate behavior. So are we depriving our children of that little bit of love and affection that a parent gives?
Then can we be surprised that there are behaviour management issues at school because schools are receiving children who aren't perhaps getting the love and the attention that they need, and they're not getting the support that they need. So at school, it's not much of a surprise if they are playing up, because things are happening at home that they're not happy with.
Quite, and I think a lot of the times also what you get is mums who are isolated, are not supported by community, because again the community is becoming, they are sort of dispersed much more than they used to be in the previous generations. My children have moved down south. A lot of parents finding similar scenarios where children are moving away from home, and therefore their children are now going to be brought up in isolation away from the wider community, and therefore there isn't that support structure for children. There isn't that feeling of the auntie will look after my child if I'm not around, and if the little Johnny is playing out on the street, somebody will keep an eye on them. There isn't that feel anymore. There isn't that feel of a community that looks after its children.
Could that be a legacy of the Thatcher years? The communities and society is broken, and it's all about the individual, the focus on the individual. Are we still suffering from the effects of that?
The individual, well, most probably partly that, but also I think just the very fact that the jobs are becoming very limited and job choices are becoming harder. My children certainly moved down south because that's where the jobs are, and they haven't looked back, they haven't come up north. So there are lots of factors. Yes, there is very definitely a me culture that's developed in a very big way, and I think it manifests itself in so many different ways. There's this huge culture of I want, and as an individual you're much more important than the society that you live in.
And the focus on me, it's about me. I mean, one of the new buzzwords of the last few years is selfie, which is a photo that you take of yourself and is usually uploaded to a social network. And that's a new word created purely about the act of someone taking a photo of themselves.
Well, again, how egocentric is that to actually sort of, think that you're so important that an image of you should be one that should be passed around left, right, and centre, ignoring the abuse factor that is clearly another major issue in terms of children actually sending images that are actually inappropriate, and therefore getting themselves into seriously hot bother over that. But the very fact that you feel you're so important, you're so worthy of being looked at, that I must then send my image left, right, and centre to all my friends. I think that says an awful lot, doesn't it?
It says a lot about the society we're living in today.
Absolutely, and I think that has a knock-on effect in so many aspects, an aspect that you actually would not expect. For example, that again sort of kicks into religion too, which quite in a very surprising way, because to me, religion in most faiths is about developing a sense of community and developing a better community. Most of the rules, if you think about the 10 Commandments, for example, which are probably central to most faiths in terms of those are things that we expect, are about creating and developing a community so it becomes a more harmonious, much better, much caring community. However, we seem to have moved away from that, and I was quite perturbed, really, at how far removed we've become from that, even when we're well-meaning. My mum passed away recently, and while you're going through the trauma of bereavement, trauma of the loss, a trauma of just dealing with the death, one of the things that I think I come from the Islamic faith, the Muslim faith, one of the things that I think that is really good about it is the way there is a culture where you get together afterwards, or you get together at the time, and there is a whole community feel, the feel that a lot of women have come, a lot of men have come to pay their respects, to give their condolences, to actually be there for you, to talk to you. However, one of the things that sort of kept cropping up was sawab. I will get sawab if. And while getting swab or doing things that actually give you brownie points in heaven is a wonderful idea, it should, in my opinion, be about community, about what you do, how to make life a better place for others and yourself. However, it turned into whole thing about me, how can I get swab? And that really did upset me.
That to me sounds like a real misinterpretation of what swab is about. I think I'm being a fellow Muslim, and I've tried to explain to my children about the meaning of swab, the meaning of, you're right, it's like brownie points or school merits. And although that's a good comparison to make to try to help them understand, it's still not, it doesn't still quite encapsulate what it actually is and means. And you are right, if people are simply looking to do things purely to build up the points so that those scales of justice weigh on their side, then I feel they're missing the point of it.
Absolutely.
And especially to use a time like that when someone has passed away, I think is even the more upsetting.
It was upsetting. Absolutely, Saira. It really was upsetting. And I think what for me was quite disturbing was, I mean, I tried very hard to sort of keep quiet and allow people to have their say and allow people to have voice their opinions, which I think is very important. However, when things became rather disturbing, you still have to sort of sit back and say, okay, I'll take this as it is, but accept the fact that people are different in their approach to things. For example, one of the sort of very important functions that have to take place, very important tasks that has to be completed, is ensuring that you perform all the rituals and all the important roles that you do to prepare that body for burial. Extremely difficult, extremely painful process. I found, having looked after Mom in her last few weeks before she passed away, the whole process of then sort of seeing a body and not a person was quite traumatic anyway. And knowing that you have to then prepare this body now for burial is quite a difficult process anyway. However, having got the message from the mosque to say approximately room for 4 women to come and perform the ritual at the mosque in terms of washing the body, I was mentally sort of trying to gear myself up for that, only to then find at least a dozen women in that room wanted to come for various reasons, because they were members of the extended family or because they were friends. But the bottom line was, it was all talk about, I will get swab if I wash a dead person. So almost at that point, it wasn't even about washing my mom. It wasn't even about preparing this person for burial. It was purely about, to perform this act will give me, personally, me, the individual talking at that point, swab. And I found that quite offensive and quite difficult to handle. While I managed it, while I kept quiet, while I sort of saw it out, while I went along with it and allowed that to happen in a way, came away quite disturbed by this whole concept of what we mean by swab. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm so sorry for your loss, and I think that's really sad that some people saw that as an opportunity just to top up their points, top up their swab, and just, so that they can do well in the hereafter. And I think that was very inappropriate of them, really inappropriate, because they should have been there to support you and your family. And that's wrong. I feel that, to me, it's a false sense of community. To me, that's a false sense.
There is, but I wonder when or how we develop this concept of what we mean by swab and how we interpret that. And I think in society generally, it has become a case of I want, I get, whether it's looking after myself here in the here and now, or whether I'm looking after myself in the hereafter. It's all about the personal gain, and that's perhaps where we are in terms of reaching a status where problems arise.
So I agree with that. I think it's not just a situation where people have talked about the Thatcher years, the legacy of that, and how the political situation in Britain has led to the breakdown of community and society, I feel that is also it's a problem that exists within Asian communities, and it feels ironic saying that because I'm using the word community, but I feel the communities quite often today offer a false sense of the idea of what community is. It's fantastic that they can be there physically when someone has passed away, when there are happy events or sad events. The community seems to get together, which is a good thing.
It was amazing. It was amazing how rapidly they got together, Saira. What struck me and struck my children in a very big way, because I think I'm because of where I live, I'm not part of a wider Asian community these days. I was staggered and quite amazed at how quickly the community came together. Mum passed away on the Tuesday. The funeral was on the Wednesday, and I think the room was absolutely heaving to the point I was thinking, it's so hot in there, people are going to start fainting, because it was just jam-packed with people. So yes, they came together so quickly. What is the purpose of that? What is it that we were getting together for? Was the bit that kind of left me a little bit cold.
The intention, I understand, I think as with a lot of things in life, it's about what the real intentions are. I mean, someone can offer words of support, and if they can't be there, that can be put aside because what they've said and what they've wanted to say has meant more. But you're right, it is about the fact that what were they there for? And whilst you were pleased that they'd all come and turned up, I think it was a bit inappropriate of people just to be thinking of themselves when that was not about them, that situation.
No, it wasn't. But I'm not necessarily, as I said, I kept my mouth closed because I think I'm trying very hard not to be judgmental, because what I want to try and understand, or what I want to try and work out in my own head is, where does that come from? Where have we developed that notion from? Who has created that notion, and how do we arise at a point where we start talking about personal swab in every activity to do with that? And for example, I mean, it just carried on and on and on. For example, when the body is there in the community centre, people came in to see her face. Now, I don't necessarily understand the religion, if there is a religious point to that, but certainly people who were very upset because they hadn't done that. And again, it was coming across very loudly that they personally wouldn't gain from having been there but not seeing the body, not seeing her face. So I don't actually understand the religious implications of that. But in terms of social aspect, the fact that they were rather upset that they didn't get their share of the brownie points was quite an interesting observation to make, I think.
Do you think for some people they just don't know what to say? Do you think perhaps some people perhaps it just, that was something, I think we have all said things that we didn't mean, and perhaps that some of them, I'm not saying all of them, perhaps because they don't want to focus on how that person passed away or the circumstances around it. Do you think perhaps we're trying to just talk about something different?
Oh, probably. I mean,
I'm not saying it was a good choice that they thought of.
No, but I think death hits people in a different ways. Everybody approaches it very differently, don't they? I mean, I think it's always interesting, isn't it, how even if you go to a strange... I mean, one of my neighbours passed away a few years ago, and I remember going to the ceremony. This was a Christian ceremony. As a neighbour, I felt I needed to go. But it was interesting how many of us actually welled up and cried. And I can remember sort of coming away saying to my friend, I said, interesting, isn't it, how we sort of relate to death. So you're right, this may be just a reaction to that whole environment. And I can remember sort of coming back thinking, well, why am I crying? I wasn't close to this person. They were a neighbour. Yes, I liked them, and I was part of that community. But bereavement, it hits people in many different ways, and it brings up your own sort of loss, your own emotions, your own things that sort of you might have sort of buried away yourself internally, but surface at a point like that. So you're right. I mean,
it can be interesting what they didn't talk about sometimes. It's what they didn't talk about that can be really interesting, and perhaps no one wanted to, out loud at least, sort of talk about the fact that they're facing up to their own mortality.
Absolutely, because a lot of those women who were probably my mum's age, or certainly of that generation, I am now aware of my own mortality, it's hit me hard. And those women in that room must have hit them hard. I mean, my papa cried and cried and cried because she is the only child left of that. I'm not saying that's the only reason she cried, but I can understand how I would, in her situation, have felt.
She feels like the last one.
Yes, absolutely, and that's got to hit you. It has got to hit you.
It's hit everybody in a different way.
Absolutely. So we all react to it differently, which is why, as I said before, I tried very hard to sort of keep quiet and allow people to say what they wanted to say. But it has sort of posed questions in my own head about how or why these things happen.
Right. I think that's quite natural, isn't it? When someone passes away, it throws up so many questions about life. You're forced to re-examine in so many ways, depending on who it is that's passed away. And I mean, for yourself, it was a very close relative. You don't get closer than your own mother. And that it brings up so many questions about so many different things. The things that we take for granted, we carry on every day. And we all read, we've all seen the slogans, live every day to your fullest, live every day like it's your last day on earth. But we don't do that in practice because partly it's not practical. And,
absolutely.
We just don't know how many days we have left. And that's a tough one. Really, how to kind of react when someone passes away. I think it's like I've always thought of it as like a knock on the door. Like you're in a room and you're carrying about your business, and it's like a loud knock on the door, and you have to face that. If you're in a room, I don't know if that's the best comparison, but it jolts everybody in a different way.
It does. I mean, mortality is a strange thing. While we all know, and that's the reality. As I said, death and taxes come to everyone. It's something that we put on the back burner and we carry on as if nothing happened. Mom, who was an elderly woman, still had her sewing out on the machine. She loved clothes. She liked sewing. She was a very active woman. Still had an outfit that was halfway being finished in her sewing machine, and yet death came knocking on the door. What do you do? So in that sense, she was living every day as if it mattered, and she carried on living. She wasn't sort of focused. While there was an element of focusing, there was you see it in little things. For example, she had very definitely become a lot more religious. She prayed absolutely regularly. She became much more aware of that side of things. So you knew she'd become much more aware of her mortality, but yet she carried on every day, living life to the fullest. And I think she was a good example in that sense. And refreshing too, the fact that an elderly person doesn't sort of go, oh, poor little me, look after me. She absolutely got on with every day.
She sounds like an amazing woman.
She was a tough cookie, and got on with every day and lived life to the fullest in that sense.
She doesn't sound very Asian, though. I mean, most Asian women I've met, elderly ladies, hypochondriacs. It's one-upmanship. Oh, you lost a leg? I've lost two. It's, your mum sounds proper hard.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things, isn't it? I mean, there's probably a cultural shift here, isn't it? I mean, you ask a white person, how are you? The expected response is, I'm fine, regardless of, whether they've just had a bypass recently. Whereas you say that same question to an Asian woman, oh my gosh, you can get a list of things, can't you?
Yes, you can. That's true. You're right. It is a cultural thing. It brings to mind to myself in the late 90s the comedy sketch show Goodness Gracious Me, and where they joked about going for an Indian. No, not an Indian. Sorry, that's the proper line. They're going for an English even.
Oh yes.
And just kind of I love the way that they joked about just the stereotypes, from our side of the story as well. Sort of tackling them, and I thought that was a good thing. I mean, what we just talked about, death, I think that's a taboo that applies to not just the Asian communities, Western society as well. It's a tough subject to talk about.
It's a very tough subject. We don't want to dwell on it because we don't actually want to be reminded of our own mortality, regardless of the fact that we see it day in, day out. I mean, every now and then you sort of hear horror stories in the news, and that kind of sort of reminds you again. I mean, there's a child in the news only yesterday, a 1-year-old who's been killed by its immediate family, presumably. Allegedly. And it frightens me when you read statistics that the chances of being killed as a 1-year-old or under one are quite high. And that kind of sort of then
in
reminds
Britain?
you of, yeah.
Oh, right.
Which is quite staggering, isn't it? And I wonder, going back to what we were saying about motherhood, whether we are isolated as people these days, and whether that sort of strain that we feel might, in some cases at least, be a contributory factor.
You mean the mental strain? Because humans are social creatures, and with the breakdown of the communities, breakdown of society, we're not communicating as much as we used to, which is so ironic when you think about the fact we have so many more ways to communicate than before. It's just almost impossible not to be in touch with anybody anymore. And we do seem to be distancing ourselves a lot more, and that's going to have an emotional and mental impact.
You're absolutely right. And as you say, how many times have we been around maybe a coffee table or in a social scenario where 3 people are sat around that table actually talking to somebody else on the phone, on their mobiles, to somebody else, and not actually interacting with each other. And I think that back to your thing about selfies, we're quite happy sending pictures and not actually interacting with people actually in physical terms. And perhaps that again goes back to how women might actually feel isolated in their own homes. And if they are sat there with a baby on their own, if they haven't got their mums around, they haven't got their family around, whether that isolation actually leads to absolutely horrendous consequences in some cases.
Right. And I think it's really important that a lot more is said, I think, in the media about postnatal depression. I think very quickly sometimes women are vilified if they have killed their child or harmed their child in any way. And of course, no one believes that is right. But I just wonder whether a lot more needs to be said about postnatal depression or sort of related issues for women in early motherhood, which can go sometimes undiagnosed, and they're not getting the support and the help they need. And that can sometimes lead to them either harming themselves or their children.
Where would you start with that, Saira? I don't know whether that is part of the problem that we face in communities generally. Yes, that may actually be a medical condition in terms of sort of needing medical support or social support in terms of sort of from the wider community. But where does that actually begin? Are we sort of quite happy for girls not to be given the support that they need from the very outset? If I go back to that young lady I was talking about who came visiting my mom, who sat there in absolute silence, whether we're actually creating a scenario for our daughters where enabling them, allowing them to have a voice just isn't there, so that when they actually need a voice and actually need that not for their own protection just, but also for the protection of the other people that they're responsible for, they haven't got that voice anymore. How do we develop that voice for the young people that we are responsible for?
I think we as women need to start with ourselves and our children. I think that's really important, rather than kind of waiting for change to happen elsewhere. I think we can all do our bit to, sort of help the sisterhood, as it were. We all think we need to start with our own children, boys and girls, and try harder, I think, just to try and create a fairer, more equal society, because we've all got a role to play. We've all, it's not just other people. We can all do it, subconsciously, because we've all been brought up in those sort of, separate roles from previous generations.
Absolutely. But where does our understanding of how we actually develop that come from? Because as I was saying before, this couple that had come with their young children were young, relatively young people, probably born and brought up here, and yet their attitudes were as rigid and as genderized as previous generations. And
Right.
that seems to be carrying on in future generations without actually a radical change.
Well, that has to stop somewhere. I'm not really sure where it can come from externally. Well, perhaps more education, better education. It's seeing more figures in the media where you see more and more Asian women becoming prominent for standing up for women's rights.
I think you've hit the nail on the head, but maybe they don't even have to be standing up for women's rights. The very fact they're out there working or actually being part of a community and actually communicating at a level that is seen as being important, actually becoming role models, basically, might actually be a starting point
Oh, definitely. The ones that will inspire and lead the way.
Absolutely.
So if they can do it, then why not? Perhaps that's what that young Asian couple need. They need more role models, more Asian women in the media, just more prominent, to kind of perhaps give them the encouragement, perhaps give them the idea to sort of, so that they can see that they don't need to bring up their son and daughter so radically differently.
If they were out at work generally, would that help? I mean, is it important just to be out in a working environment so the children see their mothers as being an active part of community?
Oh, I think it's a really tough one, that one. I think if a mother is actively working, I think she can be a really positive role model. Equally, I think there's a lot of pressure in our culture, in Asian cultures, where a woman who works is seen as neglecting her children by many, not all of course, but by many, and that puts a lot of pressure on an Asian lady to have it all and be it all. That if I'm going to go to work, I then therefore have to somehow more than be the best mother possible, because otherwise people will think it's my community will think my work is affecting my skills as a parent
or skills as a wife and a mother, because again, as you said, you can't expect to have that role shared. You're
true.
Still going to have to do that.
Yes, that's true. I think it is a lot harder on women. And if a woman stays at home, an Asian lady stays at home and does the sort of traditional, the house duties, does the parenting, a few years down the line, she can equally feel like she's expected to sort of, not know more than she does. People can turn around and say, well, why have you been sat at home for so many years? Why do you not know the local language or have got your driving license or got such and such qualifications?
Absolutely.
Because, so and so, she has them. So it's a no-win situation. If you're, I'm not saying sitting at home, of course, but if you are a housewife, the community around you can sometimes expect more from you. But equally, if you go out and use those opportunities and go out to work, the community around you will be watching you very carefully and be ready to criticize any sort of children's misdemeanors, which may happen naturally anyway, whether the mother's at work or not.
Absolutely, a case of a no-win situation, and you have to be best at everything. And yet we don't expect the men to do that. We're not expecting them to be good at housework and do all those things and be good at work. And yet, as you've quite rightly pointed out, it's almost no-win situation whether you're sat at home or working.
That's true, and no one worries about how good a father a man is being if he goes out to work.
No, indeed.
Well, this has been a really great chat with you. I would like to mention a little bit about the Awaz Women's Group, which will be running every Tuesday, 10 till 12, at the ITC Learning Centre on Waterloo Road. What we'd like to do is to get women in and initially have a coffee and a chat, but also perhaps provide support for those who are looking for work, perhaps if you need some help with your CVs, and generally perhaps if you have any worries about health, if you're worried about your weight, or if you're looking for something just a bit more, perhaps voluntary work or paid work, we're willing to offer support here at Awaz Community Radio. We'll be running it with the ITC Learning Centre, so that's every Tuesday 10 till 12 at the ITC Learning Centre on Waterloo Road. So I would like to extend a really big thank you to Tahra for coming in. It's been a really interesting chat with you, talking about what's been on the news.
Thank you for inviting me. That was lovely as always.
Well, we look forward to having you back in again to have another interesting discussion. And Tahra hopes to be at the women's group as well.
I certainly look forward to that.
Making the teas and coffees?
Excellent, yep. I'll bring the bickies.
You'll bring the bickies, right. So Tahra is on bicky duty. So if we haven't got any bickies, we know who to blame. You've been listening to Awaz Community Radio with your host, Saira. Thank you for listening.